This is the cap I wore as part of my uniform nearly every single day of my Navy career. You see many veterans walking around with different hats. Usually they say veteran of what war they were in or what campaign they served. But in the Navy, you receive a cap with a crest and the name of the ship that you serve under. This one's embossed with the front that says USS Gunston Hall, a ship I fondly remember. Yet at the time, I didn't know how much I would appreciate it over a decade later. The USS Gunston Hall is not a pretty ship by any means. It isn't a ship that you see many movies made about. It's not a ship that would get any real recognition in the media. No promotional videos, no recruiting posters are going to feature this ship. But it was my home for the 4 years I served as an engineman. Again, a job, a title you probably never heard of, because there's not much glamour in this rate. But for any engineman or snipe, you know we run the ship. This Veterans Day, I want to talk about those men and women that I served with and share a little bit of those personal stories I look back to every year. Now, the first thing I realized when I first walked on that big piece of metal floating in the water was that no matter who you are, you're instantly one of the boys. As soon as I walked out onto the quarterdeck and tried to explain who I am and show my orders, this petty officer comes out of seemingly nowhere and asks, "Hey, are you an engineman?" I tell him, yeah, and before I knew it, he claimed me and rushed me off to the engineman berthing. It was like a whirlwind, and before I knew it, I'm dressed out of my dress whites and into civvies, surrounded by a bunch of guys who told me their names at the moment, and I couldn't remember a single one at that time. It's still a blur to me to this day. The next thing I remember, I was sitting in an Irish bar in Rota, Spain. It was like a scene from any Navy movie. A huge group of sailors drinking, laughing, and cussing loudly, and couldn't help it but be in a great mood around these guys. And so many of these guys were quick to introduce themselves and try and buy me a drink. It wasn't until I told them that I don't drink that all hell broke loose and they got wild. They wouldn't take no for an answer, and seemingly instantly a round of Irish car bombs was in everyone's hand and one sitting right in front of me. I gave in and dropped a shot of Jameson and a pint of Guinness, and showing how much of an amateur I was, I tried sipping it. But that's all they needed was for me to give in a little bit, and the novelty of me died down some. I remember walking back to the ship knowing that I was going to be setting off the next day and unsure how these guys were going to be doing it, as drunk as they were and probably as hungover as they were going to be. Now, that was my first memory of being in the Navy, really being a part of something bigger than myself. As crazy as it was for a new sailor who never drank and never cussed, I felt like I was where I was meant to be at that moment. And looking back now, I realize how fortunate I was to have so many good memories and be spared the tragedy of war. That's not to say I didn't experience the evils of the world. I was in some bad situations and at times some close calls that I'm grateful I walked away from. But I began my service in 2005, 6 years after 9/11 and the suicide bombing of the USS Cole. The Cole had a huge impact on how I viewed the sacrifice of the Navy. In boot camp, we were trained in mass casualty drills and always pushed to remember the unfortunate disaster. When I was in A school, one of my instructors was on a sister ship that deployed to relieve the crew, repair damages, and look for survivors. He told us how when his ship arrived that the crew didn't want to be relieved. They wanted to push forward. They wanted to save their ship. They wanted to save their shipmates. He told us how they worked until their bodies gave up, how they slept for a few hours on the deck over that rough, non-skid coated steel. These were the brothers and sisters they were fighting for, not with guns or tanks or any other weapon of war, but with wrenches and torches against time and water flowing through. It was a sobering story for a new sailor. Now this brings me to what I want to share. It's been just over 11 years since I was medically separated from the Navy. My injuries have led me through multiple visits to the VA. I sit there sometimes and I look around at all these veterans. I see missing limbs. I hear stories of chronic injuries from bombs and guns, and I see the paranoia in the eyes that PTSD have claimed. I see old friends like Gabe Lopez, who is my brother's best friend, who I consider a brother of mine. I see him and know his soul is not the same that left all those years ago. His heart is heavy with the experiences that he has gained, and I feel inadequate to sit beside them. How can I compare my time and service to the sacrifices that they made? But then I look at my shipmates, the family that I gained those 4 years, and I look at each one of those faces and I think they are heroes. It's sometimes hard to see ourselves in that way. We can see it in everyone else, but ourselves? The Navy sailors are not those brave souls that rush into battle, those hardened hearts that deliver freedom, sometimes at the cost of their own. We are the men and women that support them. We are the ones that provide intelligence, transport supplies and reinforcements. We are the ones that offer medical assistance abroad and a hot meal for when their tour is done and when they're more than ready to go home. We sacrificed our families, our own freedom to deploy to stay out at sea for weeks or months on end. Day in and day out, we sailed, manning a floating city. And for us Ingermen down in the hole, we were the snipes that you never seen. We didn't wear those nice pressed white uniforms. We didn't man the decks when we pulled into port. No onlooker gazed upon us in awe. We were down in the hole, keeping the lights on, moving the huge piece of metal through the seas. We were making the water that everyone drank and heating it to cook and clean with. Nothing on that ship was happening without an engineer. It was that sense of pride that I felt being an Ingerman. I didn't need glory nor accolades. I had my shipmates, and I knew that no matter what went down in the hole, we were in it together. No matter what engine room you came from, if it hit the fan, everyone pulled together. It wasn't just engineers that came to my rescue. You see, when you have 4 diesel generators and the third one goes down in the middle of the Atlantic, somehow having water seep into the oil time and time again, you don't sleep until the engine is back up and running. For days, we worked tearing down and rebuilding oil coolers and pumps. We wiped bilges and pumped that milky oil from under the decks. I remember enginemen from A-Gang, Dean and Ladley, and Figueroa, electricians like Blake and Loretti, down in the pits with me. I remember the CS's, Brandon Bissett and Tessa Scott, bringing plates of food to us, knowing we wouldn't be able to leave to the mess decks to eat. We gratefully took the to-go plates, hands full of grease, oil, and soot, and thought of them as heroes when we needed for the second wind. That was what the military bred, unity, a family of serving not just our country, but each other. And maybe that's why I enjoy hospital nursing so much, the feeling of unity that you just can't get from an office job or sitting behind a desk. That feeling that you are a part of something grander in scale. Of course, it wasn't all harsh. We joked around plenty and got to know each other intimately, as anyone in the military would. You see, when you work and live side by side with each other, you become close. And not always in a positive way, but I tend to remember the good times much more vividly. I remember sitting around the lab room with Dan Vosberg and James Clark talking about motorcycles and what mods they were going to be doing to them when they got back. I remember the time when Clark got cut off by a car and he laid his bike down going down the highway. And wouldn't you know it, this dude, as tough as he was, told the ambulance to take him clear across Hampton Roads to Portsmouth Hospital. Why? Because he didn't want to go deal with the headache of the medical bill going to a civilian hospital. He came back with a cast on and still didn't have a problem going down in the hole and turning a wrench. Now, the engine room directly forward of mine was full of the craziest, coolest guys on the ship. Armstrong, Gould, Murphy, Hubbard. One of them was this tall guy, Troy Hunt, who was from Dallas. So of course, you know, we got along real well. I remember getting my first taste of hazing from these guys. I got a wire brush to the back of my left thigh that I can still feel today. But it was Troy that proved to have a story I never tire of telling. He's always been a funny guy, sarcastic, and with that witty type of humor that tends to sting the thinner-skinned civilian world. And yet he had a girlfriend on the ship that he was playful and sweet with. Brandy was a QM, but I always remember her being a part of M Division. When we were on the mess decks, she was there. And when we were out on leave, she was with us. It was just natural to see her there always, and no one thought twice. It was at the end of our second deployment that we were finally pulling into a home port. We were all ready to get to shore power and shut everything down. But Troy, he had something else in plan in mind. In his dress blues on the pier, Troy was on one knee waiting for Brandy. He proposed to her on that pier, and they married soon after. They live in Dallas now, started a family with their son, and I tell you, they're one of the most beautiful couples I have the pleasure of knowing. My shipmates, as much as I appreciate them, cannot compare to what it feels like seeing someone you grew up with in uniform with you. I had the fortune of joining around the same time as 2 of my very good friends from high school. First, there was David Bowen. He was also in ROTC at my school, and although he was in a lower grade than I was, ROTC guys usually tend to stay together. We used to hang out all the time, sneaking out to get lunch off campus and getting into shenanigans at night like teenagers do, driving around, acting crazy. He actually enlisted before I did and became a helicopter mechanic. It was stationed on Norfolk Base, and when I got there after leave from A school, he showed me around the hangar and where I got to sit in the cockpit and see how the barracks looked on the other side. I was real lucky and grateful to have him welcome me before shipping off to meet my ship. It was that hospitality that eased my nerves about the reality I was unsure of. My other friend, of course, was Miss Jessica Conkling. She goes by Cook now, but I know her before she changed her name. This girl and I have been close since the first days we met. I can't remember high school without Jessica being there. We drove around all day, all night, listening to EDM and having some crazy ROTC parties. I taught her how to drive in my car, and her dog Deacon was always my co-pilot. I remember when we joined around the same time, but she became an Army mechanic and listed before I did. We never lost touch that whole time, sharing stories through emails whenever we could catch one another. One day, Jessica surprised me and told me that she got orders to be a general's driver on the Little Creek base just down the road from my ship. It was a fun couple weeks where I brought her on board the ship for a tour and I showed her everything I could. She was my very best and dearest friend, and the pleasure of having her there was like a shining glimmer of home next to me. And being from Texas, you can imagine how homesick it gets outside the Lone Star State. I am thankful for all the people I have known during my time served. I cannot think of my life being complete without these men and women in my life. We have shaped each other forever. We have been together through the good times and the bad. And I would not change the life that I've been given for anything. And I must apologize that I do not even scratch the surface of all those who I want to talk about, all those that I have met since my discharge, and those that continue to serve. I promise you I will share our stories in detail sometime, but I know that you are supporting me as I take this journey towards documenting my life. And to all those who serve and continue to serve, whether it be in the front lines or in the support of those who are, you gave your life, and I thank you because I know that freedom comes at a price. And liberty is endured because of your sacrifice, and we as Americans are grateful. God bless America, and happy Veterans Day.